the quietest sound of justice. A single slap cracked through the air, startling the courtroom into silence. It wasn't just the sound, it was the audacity. Officer Brandon Knox's hand had just struck a young woman in the face. That woman, dressed in her black robe, barely flinched. She raised one hand to her cheek, feeling the sting spread like wildfire across her skin, but her gaze remained level, her breath steady. She didn't cry out. She didn't react. Not in the way the officer expected. Because she wasn't just any woman. She was Judge Naomi Ellison. But Knox hadn't realized it yet. The murmurs swelled like rising water. A few chuckles echoed from the officers seated nearby, dismissive, smug, as though what had just happened was nothing but an amusing disruption. They didn't know who she was. To them, she looked like an intern, or maybe a junior clerk, someone whose voice had never mattered before. Naomi could feel the familiar wave of humiliation threaten to break across her composure. The disbelief, the indignation, the sheer disrespect. But she held it back like she always had, like she had learned to do for years. This wasn't new. The looks, the whispers, the condescension of older colleagues who smiled through gritted teeth when she entered a room, only to later question her competency behind closed doors. The courtroom, the very space she had worked so hard to command, had never quite been hers in their eyes. Until now, she adjusted the sleeve of her robe, revealing the embossed seal of the Ninth Circuit Superior Court's subtle but unmistakable signal of her authority. Her voice, calm and unshaken, rang out into the silence. "I'm Judge Naomi Ellison," she said evenly. "And I'd advise you, Officer Knox, to remember what that means." Knox laughed. A short, cruel bark of sound. "Sure you are, sweetheart. And I'm the mayor." His words cut through the room. They landed like bricks, heavy and mocking. Then he leaned closer, his voice low but sharp. "Why don't you stick to fetching coffee?" The crowd went still. Naomi stood unmoved. Her dignity hadn't wavered, not even for a second. Suddenly, the doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A moment of tension fractured as senior clerk Rosalind Booker rushed forward, a folder clutched tightly in her hands. She whispered something quickly to the bailiff, her tone urgent. The bailiff nodded grimly. Then he stepped forward. "Officer Knox," he said, his voice controlled but cold. "Step away from Judge Ellison immediately." Knox's mouth curled in disbelief. "Judge? This girl?" The bailiff didn't flinch. "This is Superior Court Judge Naomi Ellison. You just struck a sitting judge." The room froze. The smirk vanished from Knox's face as realization settled in like cold water over his skin. His bravado drained, replaced with an incredulous stare. The officers who had laughed beside him now avoided his gaze, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Naomi stepped forward, still calm, still dignified. "Officer Knox," she said gently, "you wear a badge that's supposed to represent protection and service. But today, you used it as a weapon. You didn't just disrespect me. You disrespected every officer who believes in the oath they swore to uphold." He tried to speak. Nothing came. Naomi didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room was listening now. Rosalind spoke up from the side. "Judge Ellison's rulings have shaped national policy on police accountability. You didn't just disrespect a judge, you disrespected justice." Silence. Knox lowered his gaze, suddenly aware of just how small he'd become. The arrogance was gone. All that remained was a man exposed by his own ignorance. Then the courtroom doors opened again. Deputy Mayor Alexis Grant entered, her heels clicking firmly against the floor. She approached with measured steps, her expression solemn. Standing beside Naomi, she turned to address the room. "Judge Ellison," she said with conviction, "this city owes you more than gratitude. Your clarity and restraint in moments like these remind us what justice truly looks like." She turned to Knox. "And Officer Knox," she said coldly, "you failed. Not just to recognize a judge, but to recognize human decency. That failure is your disgrace, not hers." Knox stood motionless. He looked to his peers for help. None came. Naomi stepped forward once more, addressing him one final time. "I don't seek revenge," she said quietly. "I seek accountability." Then she turned to the bailiff. "Escort Officer Knox from the courtroom. Notify Internal Affairs. Begin a full review of his conduct and all prior complaints." Knox didn't resist. There was nothing left to fight. As he was let out, Naomi turned to the remaining officers. "You hold a public trust," she said softly. "Remember what that means. Remember what happened today." The room listened not just out of fear, but out of respect. One by one, officers lowered their heads. Some stood straighter. Others quietly reevaluated their own behaviors. A senior officer stepped forward. "Judge Ellison," he said quietly, "I apologize. This isn't who we are. This isn't who we want to be." Naomi nodded. "Then make sure it's not who you become again." And with that, justice returned to the courtroom not with fury, but with truth. In the days that followed, the story rippled across the city. The footage went viral, not because of the slap, but because of the silence that followed. The power of restraint. The authority of calm. Judge Naomi Ellison never mentioned it again. She didn't need to. The city responded on its own. The police department launched new accountability programs. Respect training became mandatory. Naomi's name became synonymous with unshakable integrity. Officer Knox, in time, released a public statement of apology. He left the force. Later, he joined a restorative justice program, speaking to new cadets about humility and the dangers of unchecked power. But perhaps the most meaningful change happened quietly. A scholarship was created in Naomi's name, dedicated to young women pursuing law and justice. Every year, Naomi attended the ceremony never as a symbol, but as a mentor. Officer Sarah Lynn, the young woman who had watched it all unfold in silence that day, later rose through the ranks as a reform leader. Her badge, she often said, meant nothing if it wasn't worn with conscience. Judge Naomi Ellison changed everything not with shouts, not with spectacle, but with the quiet, steady weight of truth. And sometimes, that's all justice really needs. Weeks after the incident, the city moved with an energy that felt both sobered and reawakened. Judge Naomi Ellison had not only withstood public humiliation, she had redefined the meaning of quiet power. But for Naomi herself, the days that followed were not filled with celebration. They were filled with introspection. She returned to her chambers the next morning, her desk covered in notes. Handwritten letters, some from fellow judges offering apologies, others from young women thanking her for standing tall, for saying what they themselves had no words for. And some were anonymous. A few bore scrawled messages of hate, resentment, cloaked in cowardice. "You embarrassed the department," one read. Another simply said, "Stay quiet next time." But she didn't need to answer them. The courtroom already had. That week, the Chief Justice of the state personally requested a meeting with Naomi. Not in private chambers, but in a full bench session. There, in front of her peers, she was commended for exemplary judicial conduct under pressure. "I didn't intend to make a statement," she said when asked. "I just refused to be erased." It was a simple truth, but in that simplicity, there was a storm of meaning. Meanwhile, at Precinct 42, Officer Knox's former unit, the fallout continued. His partner, Officer Dana Morales, who had laughed during the slap, filed for early retirement. Not out of guilt alone, but because she realized she no longer recognized herself in the mirror. And in his old locker, an unsigned note was taped, scrawled in pencil. "Dignity never needs to raise its voice." The internal review Naomi ordered became more than an investigation into one man's actions. It uncovered years of buried complaints, use of force against black teenagers, traffic stops based on appearance, complaints of misconduct swept quietly under the rug. Knox had not been alone, he had been part of a system that protected indifference under the guise of discipline. That system, Judge Ellison ruled weeks later in court, was unconstitutional. In a sweeping decision that spanned 72 pages, she wrote, "Justice without accountability is merely delay in disguise. Law must serve dignity, not mask its absence." Her ruling made national headlines. But Naomi didn't read the coverage. She didn't need the attention. She still arrived at the courthouse early, as she always had. Still brought her coffee in the same ceramic mug. Still wore her robe like armor, but one woven of integrity, not image. On a quiet Friday morning, she received a call from a local high school teacher. The students, many of whom had watched the courtroom footage in their social studies class, had started a new club. They called it the Quiet Authority Initiative. Its mission? To train young leaders in calm conflict resolution, law, and advocacy modeled after her example. Naomi visited the school discreetly one day, sitting at the back of the class as the students debated ethical dilemmas. One girl stood up barely taller than the lectern, her voice trembling as she argued that integrity had more influence than position. Naomi didn't interrupt. She simply smiled, and when the class ended, she left a single note on the whiteboard. True strength is never loud. The principal later framed that message. As months passed, the city began to transform. The police review board, which had long been seen as a ceremonial formality, underwent restructuring. New board members were appointed, many of them women, several from marginalized communities. Their mandate was clear: independent oversight, real transparency. Officer Sarah Lynn, now promoted to sergeant, became the first in her department to volunteer for ongoing civilian review panels. She often spoke to new recruits with candor. What happened in that courtroom wasn't about a judge being disrespected. It was about how easily we forget humanity when we stop listening. One evening, she called Naomi directly. "I wanted to say thank you," Sarah said. "For what?" Naomi asked, surprised. "For changing the way I see the badge. I don't carry it the same way anymore." There was a pause. Then Naomi replied, "Then the badge finally means something." By the end of the year, Naomi was offered a higher appointment of federal bench nomination. The White House had taken note. Senators had quoted her rulings in subcommittee hearings. Journalists referred to her as the quiet reformer. She declined the offer. "I'm not finished here yet," she told the governor. "This bench still has work to do." Her refusal sparked debate. Why would someone so qualified turn down elevation? But Naomi didn't need a higher title to make change. She understood something deeper. Justice wasn't about climbing, it was about anchoring. Staying where the wounds were still fresh, where the work was still unfinished. Meanwhile, Officer Knox, no longer shielded by a badge, began speaking at rehabilitation programs for former officers involved in misconduct. His speeches weren't polished, but they were honest. He would say, "I didn't know what power really was until I watched someone refuse to humiliate me, even when they had every right to." And still, Naomi said nothing of that day. Her chambers remained filled with quiet light, the window always open to the downtown streets. People walked by without knowing who worked inside, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Justice, she believed, should not feel distant. It should feel prescient in the way a clerk answers a question, in how a bailiff helps an elderly witness to her seat, in how a judge holds silence when the world expects rage. Years later, a young public defender stood in front of Judge Ellison's bench, arguing an appeal. She was nervous, green, not quite prepared. Naomi listened without interruption. She let the young woman finish every sentence. And when she ruled in her favor, the room paused. The public defender blinked in shock. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "thank you for hearing me." Naomi smiled, the memory of her own first hearing flashing in her mind. "I always do," she replied, "and I always will." Because Judge Naomi Ellison knew the truth most had forgotten. That justice isn't something you perform. It's something you embody, not in how you punish, but in how you respond when disrespected, not in the volume of your words, but in the weight of your silence, and not in the title before your name, but in the grace behind your actions. The slap that echoed through that courtroom didn't define her. Her stillness did. And that silence? It changed everything.